Government, Harvard University. Para introducir la presentación de la señora Carmen Reinhart, la palabra de Mariano Flores Vidal, gerente general del Banco Central de la República Argentina.
¿Se escucha? Sí. Bueno, muchas gracias por seguirnos en estas jornadas. Hemos tenido ya un panel de desinflación, donde tratamos temas de desinflación, otro panel de estabilidad financiera, y en esta oportunidad tengo el honor de presentar a Carmen Reinhart, que nos va a hacer la síntesis de lo que es desinflación y estabilidad financiera. Carmen ha dedicado su vida académica a estudiar temas de crisis financieras, de inflación y de estabilidad financiera. Su último libro, que ha sido un bestseller junto con Ken Rogoff, This Time is Different, abarca 8 siglos de crisis financieras y sus resoluciones. Espero que esta vez en Argentina podamos decir que esta vez fue diferente, digamos. Así que los dejo con Carmen para que nos haga su presentación.
Es un verdadero placer. Quiero agradecer al gobernador a Federico y a mi amigo Andy Neumeyer de muchos años por la invitación. Lo que quisiera decirles es que, dado que yo tengo una tendencia a ser creativa en el uso de palabras en español, dado que he estudiado en inglés, preparé la charla en inglés y voy a pasar a inglés, pero luego las preguntas las contesto en castellano. So what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about the global setting. I'm not here. We had yesterday a session on the global landscape, but I'd like to focus on the issue of global interest rates, because this has, of course, direct bearing on capital flows to Argentina, and I'd like to make that connection. In the spirit of connecting dots, I'm going to talk a little bit also about some of the issues that were addressed yesterday about the speed of disinflation and the role that Carlos Vey talked about, of things like PPP rules and just the general concerns about overvaluation and potential overvaluation during inflation stabilizations. Then the eternal issue of whether, if you're a central bank and you're dealing with a government running a deficit, what is preferable, the inflation tax or debt financing? And if debt financing, is it domestic debt or is it external debt? Does it make a difference? And then the larger share of my commentary is on the issue of really the very fascinating previous session on financial deepening, and when is financial deepening a blessing and when is it a source of concern. That's my roadmap, and without further ado, let me say that the bottom line of my remarks on the global setting is that, much like what Marty talked about yesterday, it's, I think, a fairly plausible expectation that international interest rates in the advanced economies are likely to remain low for some time, Federal Reserve tightening notwithstanding. And I would like to add some elements in to complement many of the remarks that Marty made yesterday, I think a compelling reason for gradualism among the advanced economies is the fact that the advanced economies are incredibly leveraged. There's a high level of public debt and a high level of private debt. The composition varies across countries. The most notorious example, of course, is Japan, where public debt is about 250% of GDP, and private credit to GDP, if you really want to talk about financial deepening, is 350% of GDP. I think there is let me also add that in addition to the sustained debt overhang, and of course interest rate spikes are a fuel to the fire if you have high debt, we have all the reasons we heard about yesterday, the concerns about sustained low growth, and also a very subdued inflationary environment. So what does this mean? Well, it means that the search for high yield is alive and well in fixed income markets in the advanced economies. When you have pension managers, when you have money managers dealing with the fact that a large share of advanced economy yields are negative in nominal terms, then the search for arbitrage and carry opportunities is very powerful. Argentina has come into the market at a time in which the capital flow bonanza and the commodity bonanza for many emerging markets was subsiding. And so offerings, whether it is by the Argentine government, federal or provincial, or by the private sector, are going to have a receptive audience. That is the good news. That may also be the bad news, because discipline in terms of borrowing is not going to come from outside. And by the time the discipline comes from the outside, usually it's very late. So let me just make very briefly in the next couple of slides before I move on to the issues of stabilization. I'd like to take a long view there, and essentially you see that since World War II, we've had 3 significant sustained episodes of negative real interest rates. One was a protracted period at the end of World War II. That was an era where capital flows, international capital flows were controlled, essentially financial autarky under the early Bretton Woods system meant that in those days, Argentina financed itself almost entirely through domestic debt, as did most countries at that time. The second wave of international negative real interest rates was importantly in the 70s, and that actually led to a lending boom. Back then it was the American banks making commercial loans to commodity producers, and it was a big capital inflow era that ended with the debt crisis of the 1980s. And now we've had this period of sustained low real interest rates. Just to highlight the point that I made, the incidence or the share of advanced economies with negative rates is also among the highest since the World War. And I would like to make a point that has to do with stability of international interest rates. Unlike most of the 1980s, most of the 1990s, and most of the 2000s up until the global financial crisis, where markets were the big determined, interest rates were really market determined. Since the financial crisis, central banks across the globe have really stepped in, so the share of central banks are really at post-war highs, and this is what this chart is showing, that about half of the stock of US Treasury securities is in the hands of either the Fed or foreign official institutions, i.e. foreign central banks. And this also means that because, and this is not unique to the US, this is my last slide on the global setting as far as interest rates are concerned. This is a worldwide trend. Japan is buying, the Bank of Japan buys more treasuries, more JGBs than that are new issues. And under QE also, that is the same pattern for Europe. And what does this mean? It means also that because such a large chunk of the action is by official players, i.e. central bank, this has also reduced the volatility of interest rates. So interest rates are low, volatility is down, and this also means that, reinforcing the point, that the search for yield is alive and well and likely to continue. Now, the global setting, and the last comment that I'd like to make on the global setting, is also adding, now that Argentina has re-entered the global financial community, the global setting is such that there is a lot of pressure for Argentina to stabilize. Because if you look, this is taken from the World Economic Outlook. It's 191 countries, all the countries covered by the World Economic Outlook. And the world has shifted to a low inflation environment. And we've been listening to that message as we heard about all the inflation stabilizations in the last 2 days. And so Argentina's inflation rate, which is half now of what it was not very long ago, is still now high by international standards, which of course it brings to bear the importance of the subject that we've been covering in the last 2 days, which is what are some of the challenges of stabilization, how fast, and so on. So what, looking at the intersection of efforts to stabilize, to reduce inflation, and the previous remarks that I made that capital inflows to Argentina are likely to persist, here is sort of a schematic of what are some of the macro effects when those two things intersect. So on the left side of this screen, what you see are some of the macro effects, and Carlos Vey yesterday was talking about this, of exchange rate based or money based inflation stabilization. On the right hand side, what you see are some of the macro effects of having large capital inflows, which is sort of my baseline for the near term in Argentina. And what is the first item that you see as well? If you fix the exchange rate, or if you target a monetary aggregate, but the bottom line is if you're in the process of stabilizing inflation, a real appreciation is part of that outcome. If you have large capital inflows, because there's an increased inward demand, you also have real appreciation pressures. So the real appreciation pressures are a challenge that gets reinforced by the intersection of inflation stabilization in the context of large capital inflows. So that's been a recurring source of concern. I mean, everybody for sure prefers inflows rather than outflows, but inflows are also can be a mixed blessing. We know that significant sustained real appreciations raise issues about international competitiveness, raise issues about Dutch disease, and real sustained appreciations that are significant often and badly. In the work that Graciela Kaminsky and I did ages ago on indicators of financial crises, real appreciations, significant sustained real appreciations are one of the more reliable indicators of banking and currency problems. So the second issue that you see on both sides of this balance sheet is credit booms. Capital inflows, let me start with the capital inflows because that's the easiest connection. Capital inflows often take the form not just of, what we think of portfolio flows, but capital inflows also involves local banks borrowing abroad. And the temptation and the attractiveness of local banks borrowing abroad usually stems from the fact that during a capital inflow episode, a bank can access very favorable terms in borrowing abroad and then lend domestically at a higher rate, and that kind of arbitrage opportunity has, in varying degrees, been a consistent source of capital inflow. In other words, and this was, I think, also in the discussion on Spain before the global financial crisis. A lot of the bank funding was borrowing abroad. It's a common pattern. The fact that banks have greater access to funds also means, and that activity is recuperating, means that there's increased demand for credit, and credit booms, the good and the bad, usually are part and parcel of the capital inflow story. Credit booms are part and parcel also of the exchange rate-based plans. What Carlos talked about yesterday, boom, early, late recession, but they're also a part of what we've started to see here as we move to the later stages of a monetary anchor in which monetary anchor-based inflation stabilization, in which the tendency is to see a recession earlier and then a recovery, and part of the story of the recovery is a recovery in credit. So the idea of the remainder of my remarks is how to avoid that last entry on both of those parts, which is, so the pressures are to reap the benefits of the capital inflows, challenges with real appreciation notwithstanding, and how to ensure that a resurgence in credit is about financial deepening and not about a bust. Let me say a little bit about the connection between the concerns about real exchange rate appreciation during disinflation episodes, but also during capital inflow episodes. This is taken from a recent IMF study, and it was the topic of some discussion yesterday, which is how long does it take to reduce inflation? Here's sort of a summary of different country experiences. And on the whole, I think if you look at the lion's share of those experiences, disinflation can take quite a while. And one of the common finger-pointing exercises is the issue of inertia. Is it indexation? Is it that expectations are difficult to tame? Is it lack of credibility? It could be a long list of things. But let me highlight that what these studies don't discuss is that in many of the disinflation episodes, and we actually heard about it this morning also in the context of Poland, but we also heard references to it yesterday in the context of Chile and Colombia. One of the factors that made the disinflation process more gradual was that in some cases it was more explicit, in some cases it was less explicit, but there was also attention paid to the real exchange rate, namely some soft PPP rules, which the more extreme case of a PPP rule is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the kind of flexibility that Colombia and Chile had, that when it looked like by different measures the real exchange rate had become overvalued, and overvalued, what was seen as overvalued, we can discuss that, but then monetary policy leaned towards a less aggressive stance. I'm not talking about a rigid PPP rule like what we saw, say, for example, in Brazil, among others, in an earlier era. So that was a factor that tended to make the disinflation process a slower one. Now, one of the things that I'd like to highlight is that capital inflows, like exchange rate-based inflation stabilizations, often have a bad ending, meaning they end with banking crises, currency crises, or both. Overvaluation was an issue that I alluded to earlier, but a second issue, by the way, this is without getting into the technicality, all I'm saying is that the odds of having a banking crisis or having a currency crisis after a large period of capital inflows is higher than otherwise. What I'd like to pursue in the remainder of my remarks is what makes the capital inflow episode or the connected credit boom episode turn into, or more likely to turn into, a financial crisis. So in that context, let me go back to the issue of gradualism versus shock. If the idea is to wean the process out of inflation, using the inflation tax, to debt financing, to no financing at all, then what is the appropriate mix? Is debt finance the substitution for the inflation tax? I think the tendency, if one is very focused on reducing seniorage and one has a low level of external debt, and I hear this often in the context of discussing the discussion of Argentina, is to say, why not go the route of external financing? Why not? Markets are receptive. Why not use the opportunity for debt financing? So what is low debt? I would like to recall the episode leading up to the 2001 crisis. By any metric, it was hard to call external debt, and there, by the way, I'm talking about total external debt, public plus private. So that includes not just the debt of the government, but private debt as well, which importantly includes the debt of the banks. But we also know that during financial crises, private debts become public debts. So I am not going to be fuzzy about separating the two. In the context of the 2001 crisis, one would look at the external debt numbers of Argentina, let alone contrast them to what the advanced economy debt is on the eve of the 2008 crisis, and would say, what's there to worry about? Why should we worry when debt would pass the Maastricht criteria? I think one of the greatest challenges that we face is that ex ante, it's very easy to make convincing remarks that by international metrics, our markers of debt or our markers of credit don't look worrisome. But I'd like to leave, I was in Colombia a couple of months ago with Guillermo Calvo, and we were at the University of the Andes commemorating the 20th anniversary of a program we started there, and Mauricio Cárdenas, the finance minister, came in and said, you know, Mauricio Cárdenas is a dear friend of more than 20 years, and Mauricio said, you know, you and Guillermo really like to worry us and really like to, you know, cause sleepless nights. You have no idea how well that made me feel. I don't mean to imply that bad outcomes are by any means inevitable. What I am trying to do is highlight that, in most instances, you never know what shocks are temporary, what shocks are permanent, and the issue of discerning ex ante what is a dangerous situation is very difficult. I would put to you that the argument that I often hear that a sufficient statistic for the desirability of taking on more external debt is that the debt is low. That is not, in my view, a sufficient statistic, because I don't really know what low is, for one. And we know that currency changes, drastic currency changes, can change low to high very quickly. If not, look at the small table on the side there. That was importantly a function of a sharp change in the exchange rate. Let me also say that, continuing on with the cautionary tales, what I'm saying here is really in the form of a cautionary tale. You might say, aha, well, if it's not external debt, we can move also from the inflation tax to domestic debt. So that also, we have antecedents for all these things in almost any example, but let's pick on the example of Greece. Greece was a country that for many years, and you saw it in one of the earlier slides, Greece was among the countries also that took a while for inflation to stabilize. But one of the things that happened, as one might expect, when they stabilized inflation was that the fiscal problem, which was fairly chronic, was not resolved. And because the fiscal problem was not resolved, but the inflation problem was resolved, there was a substitution from seigniorage financing to debt financing. And I think certainly not part of the story, but this is, we all know how that has played out. A big surge in public debt was also the combination of having had a significant change in monetary policy without a significant change in fiscal policy. Therefore, I think highlighting the earlier point that the ultimate challenge for the central bank, and we've heard this again and again, is hoping that the finance side, the fiscal side, house its house in order. In the time that remains, what I would like to do is turn from, we've talked a little bit about issues of exchange rate overvaluation and the risks associated with that. We've talked about the risks associated from a transition from relying on seigniorage to relying on debt, whether the debt is external or the debt is internal. Now I'm going to talk about something that goes alongside with inflation stabilization and with capital inflows, which is financial deepening and the growth in credit. And I'm going to make some of the parallel remarks that I made about debt. Ex ante, I made the point that it was difficult to see that ex ante, whether a 45% external debt to GDP could be called high. Well, let me, before I go on, we've heard a lot in the previous session, references to the fact that Argentina has a very low level of credit to GDP and a very low level of financial intermediation by any measure relative to GDP. I would also say, okay, that's the initial condition. That is the starting point. But let me also bring in and comment that there is a substantial amount of academic empirical literature out there that does indeed suggest that if you have a sustained capital inflow, which was sort of the expectation I laid out in my opening remarks, the odds are you're going to have a period of rapid credit growth. Now, going back to the case for financial deepening, just to highlight what has been said in earlier sessions, here is a chart of different measures, rather different emerging markets, the same measure of credit to the private sector, and of course Argentina is there at the bottom. This makes a wildly compelling case for financial deepening. But my word to those in the central bank that are involved in the supervision and regulation of the banking system is beware of undoing in a couple of years what was inflicted over a very long history, because the speed at which new credit is taking on matters. Credit booms, these are already defined as something over and beyond financial deepening, are very commonplace when you have financial sector changes. Let me show the analog of what I showed for external debt in Argentina before the before the 2001 crisis. If you look at this table, here's Australia, New Zealand credit to GDP. And you look at Mexico, and you see that in 1993, Mexico is 33%, and it goes to 39%. Would you be alarmed? We know ex ante that this led or was associated with a significant crisis. But what I'd like to do is just, because to allow for time for questions, recap some of the issues that one should pay attention to. We already heard from Governor Linde that non-performing loans look great also just before the crisis. They usually do. In my work with Graciela Kaminsky, non-performing loans actually are a lagging indicator, not a leading indicator. So what do you look at? You look at credit growth. You also try to look for issues of adverse selection. Adverse selection is something that accelerates on when there are large capital inflows. Often the best borrowers go abroad. Corporate borrowers go abroad, and the local banks are left with a second tier of borrowers. You look for the kinds of standards that are being applied to assess risk. In the United States, the first couple of tranches of the subprime loans were actually much higher quality than what followed. And a lot of that had to do with what was viewed also as collateral. During a boom, if you use market prices to value, for example, the collateral of real estate, you're going to make it comparatively easier to qualify for loans. So there's all kinds of indicators that do not involve the more backward-looking ratios of non-performing loans, or simply where you are in the financial deepening cycle. Now, I am running out of time, so I want to leave my talk with an upbeat message, which is mitigating the risk of credit booms is something that has been a big theme in the last few years of the capital flow bonanza between 2003 and 2013. A lot of countries emerging markets that received a lot of capital inflows successfully mitigated some of the risks associated with credit booms while maintaining inflation lows. So my two upbeat remarks, as Carlos Vey said yesterday, I'd like to end with a story ending well. Let me conclude by saying that during this period, two observations. Inflation stabilization, which took hold in emerging markets and took hold in Latin America, also has produced something very positive, which is relatively low levels of exchange rate pass-through. That's number one. And number two, if you look at some of the work that I've been doing with my husband Vincent Reinhart and Christoph Trebisch on how cycles of commodity prices and capital flows end, this is the first cycle since 1800 that has not ended with a spectacular spike in defaults. Let's knock wood, and as the story goes, you know, and the saying goes, the opera ain't over till the fat lady sings, so you never know. It's a very American saying, so I don't expect everyone to get that one. But nonetheless, I will stop here by saying that some of the work done by Austria and others suggests that the better macroprudential management of capital inflows is associated with the lower incidence of crises. And some of the work also done by Carlos Vey, who spoke yesterday, has highlighted that less pro-cyclical fiscal policies has contributed to that success. And on that uplifting note, I will stop.
Bueno, tenemos 7 minutos para preguntas, así que, Andy.
Thank you for a really thought-provoking and interesting talk, Carmen, as usual. I have a question. Argentina is now going through a period in which, with inflation stabilization, the capital inflows, a lot of hope of a good story being told in international capital markets, and what Argentina is doing on this financial stability front is there's a plan to reduce the primary deficit by 1% of GDP per year. They are working on trying to limit public expenditure in the provinces. And from the financial regulatory point of view, Argentina is compliant with Basel III for 2019 on the liquidity coverage and the capital adequacy ratios. And we have very stringent rules on currency mismatches, limiting capital inflows to be in foreign currency to be lent only to producers of tradable goods. So in some way, we are trying to be like a Chinese wall between foreign currency borrowing and lending to the non-tradable sector. Are there other things that from your experience of studying all these bad episodes you would recommend us to consider?
So, look, I know that, and Julio's made this comment sometimes that, you know, yesterday going from a period of heavy regulations and financial autarky, one wants to make sure one doesn't overshoot also on the other side. I worry about private borrowing, okay? I worry about private borrowing offshore because ultimately, private borrowing ends up in the public sector balance sheet, and specifically banks. So I think keeping, very close scrutiny of offshore borrowing by especially financial institutions is, I think, very wise. I also alluded to the issue of, and corporates, and I also alluded to the issue of the potential, which could be quite rapid, deterioration of credit quality. And part of the deterioration of credit quality, and we heard this also in the discussion of Poland in the first, this morning in the first 2 years, when all of a sudden you have a banking sector that goes from making no loans really to the private sector, very limited lending to the private sector, buys government debt, and really relies on large intermediation margins between deposits and pretty much, a kind of stable but stagnant lending, and you go into more dynamic system in which the pricing of new credit really requires risk assessment of a different nature. there's a lot of room for mistakes there. So I think anything that can be done on the supervisory side, and also, again, avoiding some of the procyclicality as mortgages. I know mortgages are a tiny, tiny amount of relative to GDP, like 1% or something like that. Yeah, very little. But as that grows, I think learning from the mistakes of the advanced economies, there's no lack of those. You know, in terms of the valuation process, I think is very useful. Look also at places like Canada and Australia and New Zealand, which also have taken measures when the time came. They have much higher leverage ratios to make, you know, mortgage lending a little more discriminatory, in the good sense.
Gracias.
O sea, dos.
Gracias. ¿No habría que distinguir en las denominaciones de deuda entre deuda externa y deuda en moneda extranjera? Sí. Asimismo, tenemos un nuevo fenómeno que es deuda en moneda local comprada por extranjeros y lo que esto implica respecto a la expansión de la demanda agregada y separado de lo que puede ser el descalce de monedas entre ingresos y gastos. Y además no habría que distinguir entre crédito bancario al sector privado y crédito del mercado de capitales, como para ver las implicancias.
Hacemos otra así,
perfecto.
Enrique.
English or Spanish, is the same? English or Spanish is the same?
Español está bien.
Acá se ha puesto mucho énfasis en estabilizar la desinflación y la expansión de crédito. Ahora, los bancos son además socios del impuesto inflacionario en términos de ingreso y en periodos de larga inflación han gozado de esta situación. En el estudio que ustedes, en tu experiencia, la desinflación que le quita obviamente rentabilidad al sistema bancario, ¿genera algún problema de crisis o estabilización allí?
Dos excelentes preguntas. El criterio para determinar si la deuda es doméstica o externa son tres. Uno, bajo qué ley se emitió la deuda, en qué moneda está denominada y cuáles son los tenedores. A través de la historia, los países han usado distintos criterios para definir qué cosa es deuda externa y deuda doméstica. Yo creo que cualquier deuda que tenga una de esas tres características, vaya, si los tenedores son mayormente externos, no importa si la deuda, si hay alguna reestructuración, claro que importa la ley donde fue emitido, pero la línea que divide lo que era la división, así por decirlo, pura, de deuda doméstica, es decir, deuda emitida en moneda doméstica, con tenedores domésticos y bajo ley doméstica, y la verdadera deuda externa, esas líneas han sido, es parte del proceso de globalización. Es decir, que yo la trataría honestamente como potencialmente externa, sin la parte, obviamente, de currency mismatches. Ese es el punto que yo estaba tratando de hacer también con lo de Grecia. La mayor parte de la deuda de Grecia fue emitida bajo ley doméstica, pero era los tenedores y era también en moneda doméstica, pero eso lo podemos debatir porque el euro de verdad no es doméstico, pero con tenedores externos, pero es el punto que esa línea que divide los dos se ha hecho muy débil. Con el punto de si me preocupa lo de los bancos, claro que me preocupa lo de los bancos porque es lo que yo quiero decir, y esto es, uno lo ve no tanto necesariamente por estabilización de inflación per se, aunque eso también es un factor, pero lo ve también cuando hay liberalización financiera. Es decir, de que uno pasa uno lo que ve es de que los bancos acaban de salir de un periodo donde la decisión principal era comprar deuda del gobierno, tener ciertos márgenes establecidos por las tasas de interés en depósitos generalmente más controladas y demás, a una situación donde esos márgenes empiezan a reducirse y hay todos los incentivos para tomar más riesgo. Y los bancos toman más riesgo porque quieren mantener el margen. Parte también de esa disminución del spread es de que en algún momento también empieza a incrementarse la competencia y empieza ya también la competencia por depósitos. Y eso es lo que lleva, no es inevitable, yo no quiero dejar el mensaje que para nada un fin dramático es necesario, pero es lo que lleva tantas veces a que las liberalizaciones financieras sean periodos de tanta vulnerabilidad para el sector bancario y que muchas de ellas terminan mal.
Bueno, ya estamos en tiempo. Muchísimas gracias, Carmen. Muchas gracias a todos.
Muy bien, vamos a realizar un nuevo corte y en 15 minutos vamos a retomar.